The triceps rope extension is one of the most well-known triceps exercises, but a lot of people don't feel super comfortable doing them, and a lot of people feel like their shoulders are doing all these wonky things. So today we're going to talk about how you can optimize the triceps rope extension for your specific anatomy and how you can make some changes to the motion if you don't feel totally comfortable doing it. So the triceps rope is great for a couple of reasons, the main one of which is just the fact that it can move around, right? So if you sort of stand upright and you say, okay, where are my elbows bending and straightening to? A lot of you will notice that in fact they're not straightening upward and downward at least comfortably this way, right? So a straight bar, which isn't necessarily bad or anything, restricts your hands and your forearms so that when you're grabbing the bar, you would have to really sort of force your shoulders inward, right? Or you're sort of forced to load your angles, or your elbows rather, at a little bit of a weird angle inward and outward. And again, that's not necessarily bad, but it might not feel great for you. So that's a big upside of the rope. But the downside of the rope is the fact that the rope converges to one point. And because it converges to this one point, or rather because it runs through this one point, as you lower down, if I can do this or make this, somewhat viable, as you go down into the rope extension, you have to spread the rope apart. What happens is it gets disproportionately hard toward the bottom because you have to spread it in addition to moving it downward. So a lot of people who are on the wider side don't love the rope, specifically for that reason, and also because if you have to keep the rope sort of in front of you like this, it's a really good distance away from your shoulder and not just your elbow, right? So you're loading the elbow by doing this, but you're also getting your shoulders pulled forward, and that can be a lot to manage, especially if you have a lot of load. So what are some things, number one, that you can do about it, and number two, that you can sort of adjust in terms of just making a little bit of a different variation, one that might be more specific and precise to you. So the first thing that you can do is, instead of keeping your arms in front of you like this, you can stand much closer to the rope like this and flare your elbows outward. And by flaring your elbows outward and moving closer to the rope, what you're doing is you're moving, number one, closer to the resistance. So number one, on your shoulder, it will be less demanding, right? So if I go from here, think about like this is basically like, in essence, me holding an isometric lat pullover motion if I'm all the way out here, versus if I step closer, it's kind of just wanting to pull my shoulders up, which is really, really easy to stabilize, number one. Number two, in tandem with that, if you move your knuckles toward each other and your palms outward, what that will also do is it will direct the resistance sort of in this direction, meaning that it will be still very far from your elbow, loading the triceps effectively, but it will almost run directly through the shoulder. And if it runs through the shoulder, it'll be a lot easier to manage, and you can just, pick a heavy weight for yourself, do it this way where you're stepped a little bit away, do the extension that way, and then do it like I'm doing it, and you'll feel the difference immediately in terms of how much it's loading your elbows. So that change in and of itself, simply just moving more directly underneath of the rope, keeping your hands close to you, elbows flared out, that may be enough to just totally change how this motion feels. But there are other problems that people may run into with that particular variation. And if you are that someone, what I would recommend is, instead of doing it double arm, what you can do is simply just pull the rope through so that you're dealing with one end of the rope. And then what you can do from there is really just adjust it in any direction that you want that's more comfortable for your elbow. So I mentioned earlier that the wider folks may have a natural elbow path that wants to kind of go inward and outward. And if you're using anything that's pulling you upward and downward rather than across your body, it may not be the most comfortable thing. So what you can do is, instead of sort of getting under the rope and again using it two at a time, shift one end of the rope to the end of its socket, brace up against the stack with your opposite hand, and then load yourself so that the cable, or the rope in this case now, is pulling across your body, again, to match that elbow motion. And so the way that you set this up is you basically just stand next to the rope. You say, okay, where is my hand moving? Let me just make that, boom, parallel to the rope. Again, brace with the opposite hand. And now you got a really, really solid rope extension with a single arm. And so both of these variations qualitatively will train very similar muscles, all of the triceps. But in terms of their effect on the joints, and specifically the comfort of the elbow and the shoulder and how much work the shoulder has to do, these other alternatives, again, that one where I'm sort of stepped under the rack and then the other one where I'm doing it single arm, they may be much more comfortable for you. Now lastly, if you are doing this single arm variation and you do find it very hard to keep your shoulder constrained, what you can also do is simply use your other hand, right? So I can step back like this. I can press against my working arm with my opposite hand, and that can really, really help to sort of stabilize that shoulder. And you may want to just sort of bring your arm inward a little bit closer. If this ends up being too long, you can just move the cable up, or you can grab a little bit higher. And so for me, it's really, really comfortable and stable to stand like pretty close to directly underneath of the rope, stack my opposite hand against my working side bicep, and then just go to town from there. And a lot of people say, well, the single arm variation takes too long. And I say, no, it definitely doesn't take longer if you're just doing repeated sets of this exercise, because imagine, you do a bunch of sets 2 arm, maybe you take a minute rest. When you do the single arm variation, you just don't need rest between arms. You can just go boom, 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 back and forth. So hopefully this video was helpful. If you liked any of these tips, please subscribe, please give it a like, and please share it with a friend if you think a friend can benefit from this video. Also, leave any questions that you have about triceps training, specifically with the rope, in the comments below.